That's a law that prevents religious institutions and other tax-exempt groups from officially endorsing political candidates. A breakthrough between the United States and Russia over Syria. Secretary of State John Kerry and his Russian counterpart agreeing to work toward a nationwide ceasefire starting on Monday, followed by a new military partnership between rival factions there. Here's Michelle Kellerman has more.
Secretary Kerry calls this a far-reaching approach. It not only includes a ceasefire, but also calls on Russia to use its influence with Syria to halt Syrian air attacks on opposition strongholds, attacks that Kerry says are to blame for most of the civilian casualties in the country. If all of this holds, that could lead to peace talks. A 7-day period of calm will also pave the way for an unusual arrangement, U.S.-Russian military cooperation in going after terrorist groups in Syria.
NPR's Michelle Kellerman. 500,000 people have died in fighting in Syria's now 5-year-old civil war. Stocks took a major nosedive at week's end amid concerns the Federal Reserve might move to hike interest rates sooner than expected. All three of the major U.S. stock market indices posting greater than 2% losses today. The Dow dropped more than 2%, down 394 points to 18,085. The Nasdaq was down 133 points today. You're listening to NPR.
Support for news comes from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, dedicated to the belief that all lives have equal value and working with partners to help envision a world where every person has the opportunity to live a healthy, productive life at gatesfoundation.org.
From Minnesota Public Radio News, I'm Perry Finelli. The memorial service for Jacob Wetterling will be held Sunday, September 25th at the College of St. Benedict and St. Joseph. The college announced the date today on behalf of the Wetterling family. The service will begin at 10 a.m. Other details will be announced later. Jacob was 11 when he was abducted near his home in St. Joseph in 1989. On Tuesday, 53-year-old Danny Heinrich of Annandale confessed in federal court that he abducted, sexually assaulted, and killed Jacob. Heinrich last week led authorities to the field in Painesville where Jacob's remains were recovered. Meanwhile, documents released today show authorities suspected the neighbor of the Wetterlings was involved in Jacob's disappearance because of suspicious comments he made, including to Patty Wetterling, the boy's mother. Dan Rassier was questioned about Jacob's abduction several times. In 2010, authorities dug up his farm, and he was named the person of interest. Rassier was 33 and home alone when Jacob was abducted from the end of his driveway. A school bus carrying students from the St. Paul Middle School collided with a pickup truck on the east side this afternoon. The bus then slammed into a house in the 700 block of Geranium Avenue. The truck came to a rest on its side and against the same house. Bridget McMahon lives nearby.
Came out, I saw a school bus full of children in front crashed into a house, and I ran over, and myself and somebody else who had come upon the scene opened up the back door of the bus and got the kids out and tried to contain them in one area and tried to figure out who was injured. 7 of the 34 students from Highland Middle School were transported to the hospital for further evaluation. Police say drugs or alcohol do not appear to be involved. In the Twin Cities, skies now are partly cloudy. The temperature is 66 degrees. This is Minnesota Public Radio News. It's 9:06.
Programming is supported by Minnesota Public Radio's educational sponsors. Our work together provides public radio service to communities throughout the region. One of the sponsors we'd like to thank is Concordia College.
Welcome to NPR News Presents. I'm John Wanamaker. Minnesotan Gary Cunningham is an African-American man who says we need to see in each other our own humanity. The CEO of the Metropolitan Economic Development Association and Metropolitan Council member was invited to speak at the University of Minnesota this week about what he calls a new direction for race relations in America.
One of the great things about this institution, the Humphrey School, it brings together people with different mindsets and understandings and allows them to speak their minds openly and candidly about the questions of our times. And then we can have a rigorous debate about our ideas to strengthen our democracy, and that's the underlying message, is to strengthen our democracy. How do we strengthen this institution? Now, I've learned more from people I disagree with than from people that I actually agree with. This morning I read an editorial in the New York Times by Glenn Beck, a conservative radio talk show personality who considers himself a, quote, classic liberal, aka constitutional conservative. Quote. In his editorial, Beck references the similarities of grievances between Bernie Sanders' campaign and the Tea Party. I'd actually had some similar thoughts over time myself, but the most common refrains he refers to of the similarities is, quote, "I'm not being heard. I feel like I don't belong anymore. I have no control over my future." And he says this comes out of both camps. He also goes on to describe a transformation that he underwent and has recently undergone in his understanding of Black Lives Matter. He begins to frame these differences in a more personal light of human understanding and relationships that he has as he's gotten to know and understand people in the leadership of the Black Lives Matter movement. And while I don't agree with Beck on a lot of issues, on this issue of our common humanity, I do agree with him. He goes on to state remarkably, and I must say remarkably, quote, "We need to listen to one another as human beings and try to understand one another's pain. Empathy is not acknowledging or conceding the pain and anger of others' feelings is justified. Empathy is acknowledging someone else's pain and anger while feeling for them as human beings, even and maybe especially when we don't necessarily agree or understand it," unquote. Let me give you 3 narratives that happened to me in my life that led me to believe that it really is this issue of relationship building and ensuring that we all are considered within the circle of human concerns. Don Fraser, when he was mayor of Minneapolis in the late 80s, asked me as deputy director of civil rights to conduct an analysis of the consent decree the city was under for the previous 20 years or so with the Minneapolis Fire Department. And the analysis was really to look at discrimination, why it was continuing to occur within the fire department in its selection process for minority firefighters. We found that minority firefighters, regardless of how they came through the rigorous testing, would be kicked out of the process during oral interviews. We found that these were actually that there was actually statistical discrimination and adverse impact of firefighters at the oral interview process. And we actually were able to remedy that process, but that's not the end of the story. Something interesting happened to me on the way in this adventure of looking into the fire department. I interviewed all the minority firefighters who had been promoted through a reach down program. For those of you that don't know, this is an affirmative action program that reaches down to ensure that firefighters are interviewed in the process. And when I talked to each of the firefighters, none of them would acknowledge that they were helped through affirmative action. So for each of them interviews, none of them said, "Well, yeah, I know what happened. I know I was helped through this process." But it was really a powerful experience for me. It was like, wow. In fact, there was some issue of pride and shame connected to being connected with that program. And then the even more interesting question that I asked is, because at that time there were hardly any women in the fire department, I asked these minority firefighters who had come through affirmative action, I asked them, what do you think, what do you think about women in fire departments? And every one of them said they don't have what it takes to be firefighters. It said exactly the same thing that the white firefighters were saying about them. It was powerful. It's a powerful experience. And this is interesting in that here you have a group of people that have historically been denied opportunity based on their protected class status, none of whom wanted to be acknowledged that they received this treatment, as I said. And all of them, to the person, said that women should be a part of this. Today, I should say that Minneapolis has one of the top diverse firefighters in fire departments in the country, and this is in part to the analysis in the report, but also to leadership. Actually, the leadership of the city that actually came in and set the tone and said, we are going to do this. And that was the leadership of Don Fraser, And Mayor Sarah Sales Belton made that happen. So we can be proud that it's a change. Another story, I was county administrator of Scott County, and for many of you probably know where Scott County is. Shakopee is the county seat. And I was there in the 1990s, and the population of African Americans in Scott County was 0.005% of the county. And I was actually the administrator there. In fact, I was the first African American. I don't think there has been one since county administrator in the state of Minnesota. And every year in Scott County, because it's a rural urban place, migrants would come in, Mexican migrants would come into the county, and I was sitting around with my direct reports at a meeting, and one of the direct reports says, "I hate those Mexicans. They're just come here every year, and they want to use our welfare and make babies." And I was shocked at first when I heard the statement, but there was part of me that says, oh, they feel comfortable enough now that they can actually say what they mean in the room, which was powerful. But it was also, I asked, when the person said this, I said, is it that you hate them because they're Mexicans, or do you hate them because they're poor? It was a dilemma. Part of the dilemma was that I wanted to integrate the workforce for Scott County to be more reflective of what the future was bringing. And at the same time, I was concerned about creating an edict and just coming out with, because I was the county administrator, just saying, you now are going to hire people of color in the organization. At that time, I connected with Dean Chu at the Humphrey Institute, and I asked Ed if he would provide us with a group of fellows, graduate fellows from the Humphrey Institute, all of whom had to be minorities. So I was very discriminatory in how I approached this. And Ed actually was happy to oblige, and we ended up starting a program that actually went on for a number of years at the Humphrey, where we matched up graduate students here with folks throughout the state of Minnesota to help bring new knowledge to the table for these administrators that have been at their jobs for a while. None of my managers actually had any experience with people of color. And they would see me, and as Du Bois would say, they saw me as, you're not like them. You're something different. You are an aberrant. You're something outside the norm. And all of them had anxieties about race. And in fact, one of the things that happened was that there was a conference downtown I wanted to send some of my top managers to. It was talking about new management techniques, etc. It was at the convention center. I had a couple of the managers come into my office privately and say, I don't feel comfortable going downtown. Had never been downtown. I don't go downtown. Think about that. And the uncomfortable and anxiety was really my anxiety around race. After a year of this program, though, not only did we change the dynamics through interpersonal relationship, because these graduate students and the county directors really started working together, but the county directors on their own began to hire people of color. I mean, they were coming to me saying, oh, look, I just hired someone else. And it was because they can humanize the context of the human being within who they were talking to. Otherwise, they had a frame of people of color that was on TV or in their brief interactions with people. They really had no interactions whatsoever with people of color. It was by developing these relationships that we changed the framework of how they thought about the world. This program, as I mentioned, is already and had been for many years here at the Humphrey Institute, made a lot of difference. One last story. I was working in Portland, Oregon, when I was with the Northwest Area Foundation, and we were doing some work with John Powell and the Coalition of Communities of Color. This is a group that had gotten together of ethnic, racial minorities that had actually pulled themselves together in a political framework to change the dynamic so that they could be at the table. And we were working on a grant application for sustainable communities, which was a HUD-based program. We had a grant here. That's a whole nother story, the grant here, that was managed by the Metropolitan Council here. I got introduced in this process to the Metropolitan council person that was responsible for the development and who had championed the development of the transit system in Portland. And as many of you might know, Portland is well known for having one of the most robust multi-modal transit systems in the country. His name was Robert Liberty, and he became kind of a hero to me because when I met Robert, he said, "Gary, I made a terrible mistake when we designed the transit system, because we designed a transit system and we had no people of color at the table. We actually designed a transit system that ended up having some deleterious effects on communities of color, of gentrification, and many of the communities of color." So if you go to Portland today and you go to where the black community was or where the Urban League is, that's pretty much a white community, right? Because it got gentrified through this whole transit change that happened in part. And that then where people of color ended up moving was to North Portland, and you ended up creating more segregation. So I brought Robert, after he talked to me, to the group, and he gave an impassioned apologies, probably one of the best apologies I ever heard, and about that he, as a white person, didn't see and didn't understand the context of the consequences for the decisions that were being made by not having people of color at the table when decisions were made. The response from the Coalition of Community of Color wasn't what I expected, actually. I thought, hey, apologize, we're going to move forward. They couldn't actually accept his apology. They didn't really know how to accept it. It was like, really, from them, it was out of left field. They had been used to fighting and getting what they want, kind of agitating and creating change, and then to have somebody come in and apologize, it just threw them for a loop. In fact, they didn't. Their identity, in part, were designed to develop to be advocates and not actually think about what it meant to sit at the table. And so what did that mean when you actually have to be there and have to take responsibility for the decisions that get made instead of being on the other side and advocating for change? This was something that was hard. It took quite a while, and through and part of this, and part of I should say here, is that there's also an emotional element to this. And the emotional element is the history of pain and denied opportunity and suffering that these communities have felt. These are real people. When we talk about these policy questions, this was somebody's mother that got hurt. This is somebody's sister that got impacted. So this wasn't like an esoteric kind of abstract notion of policy that we think about as we do case studies here at the Humphrey School. This was real lives that have gotten affected and impacted by this. By not treating people as human beings who should have had a role in our democracy to help shape the public infrastructure and investment, we end up in these places of paralysis, and we're locked in place. We worked hard, though, through a process of healing, and I had to step back as somebody that was trying to help manage this, and I had to think about what was my role in the getting to yes. We actually were able to move forward with the Coalition of Color, having a seat at the table, and today there's a formal agreement between 18 colonies, the Metropolitan Council of Portland, and the Coalitions of Color, where they now have a seat at the table to decide how policy happens in the city of Portland, which is a huge transformation. I raise these points not to just tell stories, but not just from a theoretical standpoint. We can talk about policy issues, but all policy happens on the ground in day-to-day interactions with people who go through this each day. If we don't see within each other our own humanity, then we're doomed to continue on a zero-sum course that binds us in the paradox of the prisoner's dilemma. In 2001, I had the opportunity with Dr. Myers to travel to the World Conference on Racism and Xenophobia in Durban, South Africa. And I was standing outside my hotel And then a small-statured African man approached me, and he looks up at me and he says, and looking up at me isn't hard, he says, "You look like you're from America." And I didn't know what he was talking about. I stood out that much, and I thought I was blending in. This man introduced himself as Archbishop Desmond Tutu, and we had an hour-long conversation on the issue of race in South Africa and America. It was powerful. The vagaries, the complexities, the ambivalence on matters of race is deep and expansive throughout the world. But it's one story in the whole world, and that story is the story of colonialism that has happened over and over again. So I was in New Zealand and Australia, and I had the opportunity to study and work with Maori and Aboriginal people. It's the same story. One of the most powerful and impressive things that I learned from Desmond Tutu was his comment, "We need to forgive, but not forget." Desmond Tutu states, "To forgive is not just to be altruistic, it is the best form of self-interest." Ambivalence on matters of race are deeply etched in American history. Thomas Jefferson hated slavery and worried about what it was doing to the country and the psyche of whites. He had a long-term, intimate relationship with the slave, and yet was one of the major architects of racial inferiority and idea of manifest destiny. Abraham Lincoln supported the end of slavery, but did not believe that the races could live together. And actually, there were various proposals to ship all the black people back to Africa or put us on reservations, and he was right in the middle of that. We are at a significant junction today in the American experiment. In many ways, we are still grappling with the legacy that has been left to us since the Civil War. In many other ways, we've come a long way. In fact, according to the Pew Research Center in July 2015, roughly 6 in 10 Americans say the country needs to continue making changes to achieve racial equality. 80% of African Americans believe more needs to be done to give black equal rights in America, although a substantial race divide remains in these views. In 2015, 53% of whites said that there's more needs to be done. And this was in 1 year, up from 39%. We're at a inflection point. We're at an inflection point in this country where you see this wide shift that happened in 1 year from 53, 39% of whites believing that something needs to be done. In the previous year, there is a widespread sense among the public that race is a significant problem that needs to be addressed. However, we have yet to come to a place where we can each learn from each other and grow as a community to build the kind of nation where, regardless of where you come from or what the color of your skin is, everybody can have access to and benefit from the opportunities that we have been afforded as a nation. On the one hand, we live in a society where many conservatives want us to be race neutral. We want to set up policies and programs so we don't see race in the picture. However, it is clear that just because something is race neutral on its face, that it is not necessarily neutral in its effect. There are numerous examples of universal approaches that have left out or marginalized people of color. John Powell of the University of California, Berkeley, gives a lot of these examples in the New Deal programs, including the GI Bill, the Housing Finance Administration, the Interstate Highway Act, and Social Security. In fact, these programs are what built the white middle class in America. Theoretically, each of these programs were set up to be racially neutral, although there was clear language in some of them that were very racist in intent. But each of these programs have had long-term devastating effects that reinforce segregation of people of color and create significant gender disparities within our society. Much has been done to correct these historic issues in recent years, from what I've heard, but I would argue that the present-day effects of these prior racialized policies have led us to and enhance the disparities that we see today. One clear example. According to the Center for Global Policy Solutions in 2013, whites had a median net worth of $112,000 versus $8,000 for African Americans. The Center for Enterprise Development and the Institute for Policy Studies published a report in August entitled "The Ever-Growing Gap. Without Change, African American and Latinos Families Won't Match the White Wealth for Centuries." It's a long title. This report really shows that it will take 84 years to amass the wealth for Latinos that white families have, and for African American, it will take an astonishing 228 years to amass the wealth whites have today. I would argue that these findings are vested of historic and present-day systems that maintain racial and economic inequalities over time. For many people, I know this is uncomfortable to hear. For many in the communities of color, we are tired of hearing another story about economic inequalities, our health, our housing, our employment, our school kids, on every measure and every socioeconomic indicator, particularly here in Minnesota, we see these huge gaps. While we might have fixed some of these issues, such as Social Security, the lingering effect of these policies remain. Without taking into account how people are situated differently to opportunity, or if you have no experience in interacting or understanding or any relationship with the community that you're designing programs for, you can inadvertently reinforce and perpetuate racial inequalities despite all the good intentions. In fact, there is a lot of documentation, both historic and present day, which shows that people of color, particularly African Americans, are not similarly situated to opportunity within our society to whites and other groups. By avoiding race in the conversation, we leave existing racial practices and arrangements untouched. Developing universal policies maintain or increase the disparities that exist on their own. However, when we attempt to adjust for these issues using affirmative action or other mechanisms to equalize the playing field, we end up in a zero-sum game dilemma. George Lipset posits that it is not really about the zero-sum question of policies, the fairness question, but instead is about possessive investment in whiteness. What we have seen in America is the need to keep the racial other out of our schools and our neighborhoods and have them controlled by the criminal justice apparatus. These approaches only work if race does matter. These arguments for white resentments are employed to protect white privilege, according to Lipset. We are left with two approaches. One is to ignore race, which has proven pretty ineffective, I would argue. The other is to target racial efforts that will raise racial resentment based on perceived fairness, and either avoid race or do something about race, which Deborah Stone in her book talks about as a policy paradox. However, on the other side of this equation, we have the liberal paradox of post-racialism. This argument is based on the idea that if an individual protagonist, a racist person that operates behind the scenes, pulling the strings, it creates a moral argument that if you do not do this or that, then you are a racist. and therefore an evil person. How many of you are evil? This analysis does not deal with the structural of opportunity, but deals with individual transaction. This approach is also wanted. In fact, many of the systems and structures operating and maintaining racial inequalities these systems maintain themselves without a specific racial actor. There doesn't have to be somebody with a bad and evil intent. These structures actually kind of revolve on their own. We begin to just frame the issue as a win-lose paradox. There is no middle ground from which we can see each other's humanity. Power matters. One of the things that I actually agree with Donald Trump is that the game is rigged. According to Thomas Piketty, we have already reached the tipping point of wealth inequalities. In his book, Capital in the 21st Century, Piketty shows that we are seeing levels of inequalities not seen since the Gilded Age in America. Today, the top 1% owns 40% of the nation's wealth, the bottom 80% just 7%. In his book, Class Wars, What America Really Thinks About Economic Inequality, both Larry Jacobs and Benjamin Page concluded that an analysis of national polling data going back 30 years on issues related to economic inequalities. They did this huge, massive, mega study of data from these polls. And Page and Jacobs found that, quote, fewer than 5% of families moved from the poorest to the richest quartile during the 70s, 80s, and 90s. These two well-researched analyses actually confirm that the game is rigged. Last summer, I had the opportunity to bring together some of the top both academics and activists in the country focused on the question of the new narrative for African American empowerment. And so some of the names are John Powell, obviously, and Ian Handy Lopez, and the whole part of the economics department at Howard University. And we had conversations in cities throughout the country with African Americans at all strata, in all cities, I should say all cities, about 20 cities. And we came together at, believe it or not, Bellagio, Italy, and we sat down and had a conversation that lasted for a week about what should we do. And one of the conclusions that we came to was that it becomes very hard to expand or create a new black middle class if the white middle class is shrinking. Our futures are tied together. In fact, working class people, colored whites, have been pitted against each other for years, and they actually have the same interests. This group of African American academics and activists developed a meta-narrative which states, today, powerful elites have rigged the system. This is before Donald Trump. Capturing the government and the marketplace. In their greed, and they are hollowing out the middle class, stifling economic prosperity, limiting mobility of current and future generations, and endangering our democracy. They've generated broad support for this toxic inequalities through a politics of fear and division. Pandering to racial anxieties and other social resentments, they encourage us to obsess about supposed threats for the most vulnerable while we ignore increasing concentrations of wealth and power to the detriment of all. We need a new approach, founded on the principles of people first and for each other. People first. Corporations, the market, and government should serve people and not the other way around. People for each other. We owe each other a duty of care and respect, seeing ourselves in others. We gain the power to create a society where all people can attain their full potential. So, what do we do about it? Let's think about it this way. Say we're all in the shopping mall together here, and the opportunity, or what we call the goal of opportunity, is on the third floor. Everybody should get to the third floor. That's the goal. So we would have different strategies to get to the goal. Some would take the escalator, but if you're in a wheelchair, it'd be pretty hard to take those conveniences. We actually have elevators. People with wheelchairs can actually get to the third floor to opportunity because we have elevators. And you don't hear anybody saying we shouldn't have elevators, right? We don't hear anybody saying, oh, that's a problem. Why are you doing it? Why are you building it up? In fact, we've created laws that you have to have elevators in buildings. So people with disabilities that are physically challenged can actually convey themselves to the third floor. We all benefit from those different strategies in different ways. In other words, we can reconstruct a system that everybody wins if we think about it in terms of how people are situated to opportunities. We want everybody to do well and everybody to have good outcomes. We don't just want people of color to have good outcomes at the expense of whites, nor do we want just whites to have good outcomes at the expense of people of color. This is called targeted universalism. And it's a different way to think about how we talk about racialized systems that are both universal and targeted at the same time. How targeted universalism alone, it won't by itself, any of these things by themselves won't solve the problem. But it adds to the value proposition that we actually can get here from where we are now. It's certainly a good way to start looking at this. So as we think about policy problems, we should ask the questions, what is our universal goal? How are people how are people situated differently in the social and physical environment? And 3, how do we invest in particular groups to place them on a path towards the universal goal? We can apply this approach across racial lines so that no matter who you are in society, there could be a path to opportunity for you. We could get ourselves out of the dualistic thinking of just targeted or just universal, race, no race, zero sum. It becomes a measure by which we look at policy and how to determine how it will impact groups or individuals situated relative to opportunity. I'm going to go a little further and give you an example of this. For example, what if we could provide every newborn child with a savings account of at least $1,250? Research has shown that this would create a solid nest egg and reduce the racial wealth gap by 20% if more of these resources were targeted specifically to communities of color. In this case, every newborn child could have a savings account, but we would also means test families based on wealth and income. So if you were a poor family, you could get more money than the average base. You could use this money for training or tuition to start a business or buy a home. It would begin to address this issue of the wealth gap. Studies have shown savings accounts change behavior and increase the likelihood of attending college. This mechanism would also build with assets within communities of color, which is one of the major differentials that you see in terms of life outcomes. However, no policy is a panacea. No approach will address all the multifaceted issues that have led us to this place of polarized issues around race. Government intervention, while needed, is not sufficient to address the issue. There's also healing to be done. So, according to the author Shelby Steele, who wrote a book called The Content of Our Character, and others, much of the current problems that African Americans and other people of color face is by their own devices. He and other conservatives espouse the idea that we do not need civil rights or other special programs to help repair the breach. This is really due to personal failings. In fact, many whites agree, according to the same Pew study that I mentioned earlier, racial attitudes have gotten better. However, 45% of whites believe blacks don't have the willpower to pull themselves out of poverty. over 40% of whites say that whites work harder than blacks. And overall, 34% of whites say blacks should not push themselves where they're not wanted. We have a long way to go. And this was an improvement over previous years. I believe, in conclusion, that Martin Luther King had it right. And many of us know Martin Luther King on Martin Luther King Day. But if you really look at his writings, they're much more expansive than I have dreamed. And he actually posits something called a beloved community. And in just a short passage, he writes, desegregation is only a partial, though necessary step towards the ultimate goal we seek to realize. Desegregation will break down legal barriers and bring men, and I would add, and women together physically. But something must happen so as to touch the heart and souls of men and women, that they will come together, not because the law says it, but because it is natural and right. In other words, our ultimate goal is integration, which is genuinely intergroup and interpersonal living. Only through nonviolence can this goal be attained, for the aftermath of nonviolence is reconciliation. That's where I started with Desmond Tutu. We need reconciliation within this nation and the creation of a beloved community. As we have seen, America has come a long way. People now can marry the person they love. Women have become more full citizens in our community, in our families, in our places, where our attitudes are shifting over this long arc of transformation of what is democracy and what is America. The next transformation has to be the economic inclusion of people of color into the mainstream of America. Without this change, we'll continue to be a divided nation. Thank you.
You've been listening to Gary Cunningham, CEO of the Metropolitan Economic Development Association and a member of the Metropolitan Council. He spoke Wednesday at the University of Minnesota Humphrey School. Stay with us for some audience questions. This is NPR News Presents.
APM Reports has spent the last 9 months looking at what went wrong in the investigation of the kidnapping of Jacob Wetterling.
Believe that they had one of the boys.
Our new podcast looks at what investigators did and didn't do.
They were saying, you took it. How'd you do it?
When accountability is not there, disastrous things happen.
Subscribe to In the Dark wherever you get your podcasts.
Now back to Gary Cunningham speaking at the University of Minnesota this week about race relations. Professor Larry Jacobs is the moderator.
There are a number of questions from folks in the audience here who are asking about equity. And as I see it, there are three different ideas of equity that are floating out here. And I'm wondering if you could help us sort out in terms of how you think about equity. There's equality of opportunity, which you've talked about. There's equality of outcome. The idea that whatever policies we develop, there ought to be an evaluation of that outcome to make sure that the results are comparable across racial and economic groups. And the third area is some notion of equality in terms of government programs, for instance, distribution of contracts or other sorts of resources that have been distributed in an uneven way. How do you think about the idea of equity and these different ideas that are floating out there?
So that was a good summation of the different views around equity. I think there is a need to address kind of the idea that if we do everything equally, and I said this in my talk, that we're going to get an equal result. That isn't going to happen given where we are today. And so there does need to be various approaches to actually level the playing field so that people of color actually can fully participate in our democracy and our society. So with that said, I do think the framing creates certain problems. Because I think not just think, I know when I've talked to whites about equity privately, many won't express this publicly, there's a feeling that I've got to give up something for you to get something. And that dynamic, when you're not taking into account the group of the concerns and interests of the dominant group, the question of long-term stability of that policy, even if you enforce it over a short period of time through public demand or populist cause, won't get you there to where you need to go. So I would argue that you've got to take into account. So if I'm a white parent and my kid is in school, and you're asking me to take resources from my kids and give it to someone else, I might be liberal and want everything to happen, but I might not do that because that's my kid, right? And so we end up in that dilemma. When in fact, I would argue this is a wealthy country. We have people that have resources that couldn't spend in 1,000 lifetimes. Yet we act as if though there's this scarcity of resources, as if we can't create prosperity so that everybody has opportunity. And so when I grew up as a kid, I grew up with the belief that I could be anything and I could do anything and I could participate in society and I could be all of these great things. I actually believe in this country deeply. But what I've seen is this wealth inequality. Madeline Albright was a guest of the Humphrey Institute recently, and I was in a room with her, and I said, Madeline, what do you think? Do you think this issue of wealth inequality harms us internationally as a democracy? And it's killing us because people look at us and say, you're a democracy, but only for some. Only certain people can participate in your democracy, and that there's people at the rich. So this idea that we can't transform our current systems to do better, so that the wealth of this country actually can be used so that we create a better and bigger middle class that actually creates a better economy, because we're all created on buying things, and if you can't buy anything, you can't participate. So I say the middle class for whites and blacks, Latinos, and other groups of color are all intertwined together. We won't get better. We can't grow the black middle class, as I said earlier, or the Latino middle class unless there is an expansion of the white middle class. And so that's where I think the equity argument should be.
The member of the audience asked, and they thank you for your presentation, and then they say, but isn't racism an integral part of American culture and history?
Yes, it is. But I can just talk about my experience. So I wouldn't be here sitting here today unless my white aunt taught me how to read and write. Unless other people that were a different race than me helped me get to where I am. And so I can't think about it in those terms. In fact, the fastest growing group demographically in America is people of mixed race. So we're going to get there whether we want to or not, whether we want to kick and scream, because people that have different heritages and and grow up in families that are mixed race have a different perspective totally about this issue. They don't see it as a black issue or a white issue. I think the president actually framed this beautifully when he talked about his white grandparents and his African lineage. I think that's where we're going as a country. Now, yes, we can be pessimists. I'm, getting later in my life, and it's easier for me to be a pessimist now than it was when I was younger. But I actually don't think that I would be a patriot for this country if I was a pessimist about the future of this country. The fact of the matter is, the Twin Cities, the state, this whole place is going to be different. And it's creating all this anxiety within these structures and within people about the future. The fact is, we need to invest now in all of these communities, particularly communities of color, in a way that we never had before. Our future depends on this.
You've talked quite a bit about range of policies, private sector efforts, and one of the members of our audience wants to press you on whether we ought to be reinventing government, and ask specifically about approaches to change that would involve school choice, lower wages in free enterprise zones, less regulation. What do you think of that kind of agenda?
Yeah. So here's where we get stuck. I think I actually believe that it's all of those things. I've worked in developing charter schools in communities. I've worked to develop issues where I think at times government regulation does get. I've also seen it the other side. When we look at the foreclosure crisis that happened in this country in 2008, I think regulation certainly was needed to address the issue of the banking industry. I think the issue of predatory lending is another area that I think clearly if you're getting 400% or 1,000% interest on loans, that is gouging poor people and that you need some regulation. So I don't come down on it like an ideologue. And I think that's where we get stuck. We get stuck in these boxes of saying either you're going to do it this way or not that way. And that's where I started my conversation out is this idea that somehow I'm going to be all the way on the left or I'm going to be all the way on the right and I'm going to get everything I want with no compromise in the middle. I think that's ridiculous, and I don't think that helps our country.
I've also been reading Shelby Steele, and just read his most recent book called Shame: How America's Past Sins Have Polarized Our Country. And as you mentioned, Mr. Steele is one of the more thoughtful conservatives out there. I want to read you a sentence and get your reaction. It's on page 18. One of the more pernicious corruptions post-1960s liberalism is that it undermined the spirit of self-help and individual responsibility in precisely the people it sought to uplift. Does your idea of building capital and entrepreneurialism in the Black community fit within that critique that Steele is offering?
Well, I won't be as over the top as Shelby Steele. I have learned a few things over the years. One of the things that I have learned is that you have to create value exchanges in relationships in order for them to work. Because I think people actually, either you create dependency over time, which has all kind of deleterious effects for communities and people, or you basically tell them to pull themselves up from their bootstraps and do it on their own. So, you got these two dichotomies that are operating. When I was at North Point Health and Wellness, one of the things that we did, which was, I thought, one of the transformational movements, was when the healthcare changed, we had to pay a premium to get healthcare at that time. I think that was under Governor Lind. And there was a fee if you were a single adult, etc. We actually created a value exchange with people that then, instead of them having to pay because they didn't have the money, they had to volunteer. And it created a community, and it created a different dynamic because then they were actually giving something back of themselves to the community. I seen this when I was on an Indian reservation in Oregon, where the Klamath tribe had been pretty much decimated, and they had taken their land away, etc. And many of the men were not working. And we did a project with the Nature Conservancy where they actually started managing the forest with the Nature Conservancy, started doing the tree cutting and all that. I came back a year later and I sat with these men that ended up getting these jobs, and every one of those persons said they were better off and they felt that their lives were more fulfilling and they were bringing back something for their community and they had value than they had before. So I think there is something to what he's saying, but I think it gets caught up into the left and right debate. And a lot of times people of color and other people get caught up in this debate. So when I work with some of my liberal friends here on the issue of healthcare reform for these men at the time that was going on at the state, and I asked them, I said, well, many of these African-American men that you're talking about that won't have health insurance, they were poor before you guys got here. They were actually, I said, and you guys will debate and battle this issue at the legislature, and you guys will be gone And these men will still be fooled. So it gets caught up into the right, wrong, the kind of intense polarity we got in this country. And there is some right, wrong to this stuff, so I'm not trying to say there isn't. But I think we've got to move out of that, because at the end of the day, we both can actually play into the role of we're using the poor people, in this case people of color, to move forward our agenda, and then with that agenda we're on to the next argument. I see that happening over and over again.
You've been listening to Gary Cunningham, CEO of the Metropolitan Economic Development Association and a member of the Metropolitan Council in the Twin Cities. He spoke Wednesday at the University of Minnesota's Humphrey School of Public Affairs. This is NPR News Presents. Next week at this hour, you'll hear a series of new education documentaries from American Public Media.
I'm Tom Weber. The Broadcast Journalist Series returns September 19th at St. Thomas with Justin Ellis of ESPN Magazine. He also wrote about innovation in journalism at the Neiman Lab. Free tickets at npr.org/BJS.
Programming is supported by Summit Brewing, celebrating their 30th anniversary with the Summit Backyard Bash behind the brewery Saturday, September 10th. Info on musical acts, tickets, and special Metro Transit passes can be found at summitbrewing.com.
Stay tuned for As It Happens.
Hi folks, what would you say if every week a single podcast could deliver to you all of the best things in the arts and culture universe?
I'm in! Join that guy, Jeffrey Tambor, and check out the Dinner Party Download, wherever you get your podcasts.
Minnesota Public Radio News is here for you with thoughtful, in-depth coverage thanks to the financial support of listeners. Because of listeners like you, staying informed is as easy as accessing this stream. Thank you for making Minnesota Public Radio News available around the world. Remember yet? You listen, give any amount that works for you. Just click Donate. Thanks.
Support comes from Renaissance Festival's Wine, Chocolate, and Romance this weekend, featuring a Grape Stomp wine tasting, chocolate festival, free vow renewals, and cupcake battle, plus 16 stages of live entertainment, armor jousting, mermaids, fairies, and more. RenaissanceFest.com.
Hi there, I'm Carol Off.
And I'm Jeff Douglas, coming up on As It Happens.
In 2012, an American drone strike killed Faisal bin al-Jaber's family. Mr. Jabber wants the United States government to tell him what happened. And now he has the support of 3 American veterans who worked on the U.S. drone program. I'll speak with one of those vets tonight.
And their vacation was in full swing, and they didn't like it not one bit, because the swinging thing 2 American women were trapped in was a gondola dangling above the French Alps. They'll tell us about the dramatic rescue that returned them to Earth.
Those stories and much more are coming up on the Friday edition of As It Happens.
Live from NPR News in Washington, I'm Shay Stevens. The United States and Russia have announced a plan calling for a ceasefire in Syria beginning on Monday. If the truce holds and other conditions are met, NPR's Alice Fordham reports the 2 nations then plan to coordinate efforts to defeat ISIS and the al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria.
Secretary of State John Kerry and Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov say implementation would begin on September 12th, with a cessation of hostilities between the regime and the opposition. Under the deal, the Syrian Air Force will not fly combat missions in areas where the opposition is present, areas which will be designated by the US and Russia, and both regime and opposition must allow access for aid. Lavrov said that if the truce and aid access holds for 7 days, the US and Russia will create a joint information center to coordinate airstrikes on ISIS and the Syrian al-Qaeda affiliate. Alice Fordham, NPR News, Beirut.
Hillary Clinton says there is more the United States can do to stop North Korea from acquiring nuclear weapons, including adding sanctions. Clinton met with a bipartisan group of national security experts today amid international condemnation over the North's latest nuclear test.
Donald Trump addressed a group of Christian activists in Washington today, promising the audience he'd protect and defend Christian values. Trump also said he would repeal a law that prevents religious and other tax-exempt groups from endorsing political candidates. A federal appeals court panel has blocked Kansas, Alabama, and Georgia from requiring residents to prove U.S. citizenship when using a federal form to register to vote. Brian Newby, who heads the U.S. Election Assistance Commission, added the requirement at the request of those states. A lawsuit by a coalition of voting rights groups argues that Newby lacked the authority to act on his own and that the requirement would suppress minority votes. Alabama and Georgia reportedly are not enforcing the laws in those states. U.S. stock markets sold off sharply today. The major indexes all fell markedly. As NPR's John Instey reports, analysts blame concerns that easy money policy at central banks may be ending.
The lack of further monetary easing by the European Central Bank Thursday, coupled with concern that the Federal Reserve might actually raise interest rates later this month, fueled the sell-off. Extremely low bond interest rates have helped push investors seeking higher returns into stocks in recent years. Rising interest rates would make stocks less attractive. Traders also worried that comments from several Fed officials scheduled for Monday might signal the Fed is ready to raise rates, so many investors decided to sell in advance. The Dow Industrials ended down just over 2%. The NASDAQ and the S&P 500 both lost about 2.5%. John Instey, NPR News, Washington.
This is NPR News.
Support for news comes from Kaspersky Lab for Internet Security, giving 400 million users the power to protect their money, privacy, PCs, and mobile devices from Internet threats and attacks. Learn more at Kaspersky.com.
From Minnesota Public Radio News, I'm Perry Finelli. 2 for-profit colleges may have to close after state officials suspended their registration and said they could not accept new students. A judge ruled Globe University and the Minnesota School of Business misled students into thinking they would have the ability to take certain law enforcement tests. State Higher Education Commissioner Larry Poggemiller says his office is working with the schools to make sure students still attending may finish out the school year.
A lot of this will be dependent on what happens next. Globe does have the ability to challenge the administrative ruling here, and they perhaps could challenge the court decision also.
Poggemiller estimated as many as 1,700 students attend both schools, which have the same owner. Lake Superior reached a near-record high water temperature this summer, Dan Crocker reports.
Late this summer, the average lake-wide surface temperature of Lake Superior hit 68.5 degrees. That might not seem very warm, but it's the warmest since 2010, and another in a string of very warm summers going back several decades. Jay Austin, a professor at the University of Minnesota Duluth's Large Lakes Observatory, says the summer water temperature is strongly impacted by the previous winter.
We found a very strong connection where high ice years result in relatively cool summers and low ice years in warm summers.
And in Minnesota, winter is where we're seeing some of the most significant impacts of climate change. The average winter temperature in the state has risen by about 1 degree per decade since the 1970s. Dan Crocker, Minnesota Public Radio News, Duluth.
In the Twin Cities, skies are partly cloudy. The temperature is 65 degrees. This is Minnesota Public Radio News. It's 10:06.
Hello, I'm Carol Off.
Good evening, I'm Jeff Douglas. This is As It Happens. Tonight,
they were part of the problem, so they're part of the dissolution. All 3 members of the panel reviewing the Energy East pipeline have stepped down after accusations of conflict of interest.
Pipe, counterpipe. Today, a federal judge in the United States said the Dakota Access Pipeline could resume construction, and then, to the relief of indigenous activists, the federal government put the whole thing on pause.
Target malpractice. A man from Yemen is trying to compel the U.S. government to explain the drone strike that killed members of his family. Now he has the support of 3 American veterans of that drone program.
Censors and sensibility. Facebook deletes one of the most famous photographs from the Vietnam War, then reconsiders. And a Norwegian editor who fought the ban says the social media gatekeeper needs to open the gates.
From commander-in-chief to parasite in reptile, Barack Obama has a special place in one scientist's heart, and the flatworm he's named for the U.S. president has a special place in Malaysian turtles' runs.
And they hadn't planned to stay up so long, or so up. 2 American women were among dozens of people who spent hours in cold cable cars dangling above a French mountain before being rescued by helicopter. As it happens, the Friday edition, radio that also hates to be left hanging. All 3 members of the panel reviewing the Energy East pipeline proposal have stepped down. The National Energy Board made the announcement late this afternoon. The panel's impartiality had been called into question after news broke of meetings between members of the panel and former Quebec Premier Jean Charest. The National Energy Board says that hearings will resume with new panelists, quote, free of apprehension of bias, unquote. But it may take more than that to get Serge Simon on side. Chief Simon is the Grand Chief of the Kanesatake Mohawk. We reached him in Kanesatake.
Grand Chief Simon, what is your reaction to the news that the Energy East Pipeline Board, all 3 panel members from the National Energy Board, have stepped down?
I think it's really good news. It indicates what we've been saying all along, that they lack credibility. And hopefully that now the Trudeau government will learn the lessons that we've been saying for a long time and maybe enter into a different process. This is a new opportunity to redress a lot of problems with this process from the Conservative government.
What would it take for the National Energy Board to earn your trust?
It's not up to the Energy Board. It's up to the Crown and the First Nations. The Energy Board has nothing to do with it. They are not the treaty signatories to First Nations. We need to talk to the people who are responsible to uphold the honor of the Crown regarding the rights and titles under treaty.
Would there be anything that the federal government could do that could persuade you to agree with the Energy East pipeline application?
That needs to be discussed. Like I said, if a process takes into account our Aboriginal titles, our rights, our treaty rights, the Constitution, and so on, if we go into a process like that, it gives us a lot of room to talk and see where we could have common ground. But our main concern has always been the tar sands and what the tar sands are doing to the environment. It's a symptom of a larger problem, but right now it's a problem I think we can deal with. But we need to find the right process to do that in.
What would be the common ground? What could possibly the federal government do, or the pipeline company, or any of the parties involved? What could they do to convince you, what could they change or do to convince you to accept this project?
Well, for starters, it's all hypothetical right now, what they can or can't do. The industry, we know for sure, we don't want to speak to the industry right now. Let's come up with the process, and then we'll see what the process comes up with. If the Aboriginal rights and titles are respected, a lot of things can come out of that. We could have a greater say in the environmental impacts and the formulation of future environmental regulations when it comes to our lands.
Why don't you want the industry to be part of that discussion?
Well, when I speak to the industry, I'm actually creating a prejudice on whatever claims I might have within the territories that these industry people want to exploit, whatever it might be, a mine or whether it's a pipeline. You need to take that into consideration, because the Crown is the one that's ultimately responsible for the treaty and Aboriginal rights.
And have you ever had conversations with TransCanada, the pipeline company?
Not directly. We spoke with Ishkonigan, which was the consultant that was hired to come and speak to First Nations. This was Phil Fontaine, the ex-National Chief's little company he started. And they brought them in here thinking maybe native to native we could have some kind of understanding, but that kind of backfired because they were asking us questions on the lands where the pipe is going to pass about our traditional knowledge, our present activities in those lands, and so on. If I answer those questions without the Crown present or a process we both agreed on, I am creating a prejudice future prejudice to that group. So I need to speak to the right people, and the industry is not the right people.
And so tell me about the concerns. Tell me about the land and what impact do you think this pipeline would have on the land and on your community?
Well, the pipe is slated to pass under the Ottawa River, which is about 12 kilometers upstream from my community. If there was a rupture in that pipe, and we know these pipes break, and when they do, it's not a small spill. And we're talking about bitumen, we're talking about dilbit, highly toxic, very dangerous to our environment. It would take somewhere around, according to a study that was done, that I read, 45 minutes to travel at 12 kilometers. And I asked them before, I asked these people from Ishkonigan, what are you going to do if there's 4 feet of ice on that river when the pipe bursts? What are you going to do to retrieve that under 4 feet of ice? And it's like they never thought of it. Okay, well, sorry, but I'm not going to risk it.
Now, where we are right now is that the National Energy Board says it's going to proceed with hearings of a new panel that it said will be free of the taint of bias, which I guess that's a kind of admission that there was a taint of bias. And so, but you say that no matter what, the National Energy Board is not the body that you will sit down with for this.
No, not at all. It's like they haven't learned anything. We're going to continue on with the same process that was ultimately rejected. It's the whole process itself. Even if they change the board members at this point, we still have the underlying principle that the whole process is flawed. Whether it's for pipelines, whether it's for mines, fisheries, whatever, the Crown does not adequately consult us under our terms. These are our lands guaranteed to us by treaty, and that's been violated left and right. Eventually, we're going to say enough is enough, and that's the time's come. We're saying enough.
Grand Chief Simon, I appreciate speaking with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Good.
Serge Simon is the Grand Chief of the Kanesatake Mohawks. In 2012, Faisal bin Ali Jaber's family was killed in a drone strike on a wedding party in Yemen. Ever since, he has been trying to figure out why. Mr. Jaber is trying to take the U.S. government to court to force it to admit that the strike was unlawful. And now his case is being bolstered with an amicus brief filed by 3 United States veterans who worked with drones during their time in service. Sean Westmoreland is one of those veterans. We reached him in Colorado Springs.
Sean, can you explain why you're supporting Faisal bin Ali Jaber and his attempt to take the United States government to court?
Well, I think this particular case represents the plight of many innocent victims and family members of drone strikes, and I think in this particular case it definitely warrants an explanation. I mean, we bombed a wedding party. His brother-in-law was an imam that was preaching against Al-Qaeda, which sends a horrible message, if you ask me. You know, killing a individual who is on our side.
Their brother-in-law, was a Muslim imam who was killed in that drone strike, and also Mr. Jaber's nephew, who was a police officer who was there just to watch over, and he was also killed in that strike. Mr. Jaber wants to know why both of his relatives were killed in that drone strike.
Exactly. And I think more generally, as a policy, I think it would be intelligent for the U.S. military to acknowledge the humanity of these people on the ground, because that's one of the main issues there with drones, is that it really takes humanity out of the equation, because we're not putting any skin in the game.
And say we have no skin in the game. You mean the United States doesn't put any soldiers on the ground. They're not in combat. This drone program is done from thousands of miles away, where they can drop these lethal bombs into, as you say, wedding parties.
Right. I've met Faisal personally, and I personally think that everybody should have the right to know what it was that killed their family. It's a little difficult to do in a war zone, but in Yemen or Somalia or Pakistan. These are all countries that we haven't actively declared war on. So, especially in situations where the legal precedents for going into their country are shaky, we need to be exceptionally sensitive to that.
But from your own experience of operating drones and working in the drone program, what do you suspect happened? Why do you think that Faisal's family members were killed?
From what I understand, this is a signature strike, and they were probably looking at the pattern of life activities surrounding certain individuals that were at that wedding party. I don't know if you've taken statistics, but if you have, you kind of understand what the problem is with quantitative data. If one variable is off, then you throw off the whole statistic. And a lot of these strikes are determined based off of almost purely quantitative data. You know, as with a lot of ways of killing people, there's always the margin for error there. I think the Obama administration is sensitive to admitting the faults with the drone program because the image that they're trying to portray is that it's very precise, but I think probably that the best thing to do in the long run is to admit the faults of what happened and try to work from there. You're not fooling anybody on the ground. It's just the American public.
Right, and then President Obama, when he defends using the drones, he says that this is a quote, he says that there is a near certainty that no civilians will die. From your own experience, is that correct?
How near of a certainty? That's the question. You know, if you're bombing a house, generally there's a lot of people in there that probably have no knowledge of what certain individuals are doing. Were they in the same room? Or was it that they were actively engaged in plotting attacks? It's important to understand that. And there are just people who are probably not affiliated to the extent that would warrant death, because that's essentially how we're conducting warfare these days. It's not necessarily warfare, but it's execution of individuals based off of secretive data. I guess the argument there is that it's actually, killing less people and sending in ground troops, but from the people on the ground's perspective, you're essentially killing people from behind the wall. You're essentially saying that you can determine whether they're good or bad based off of algorithms that nobody fully understands.
Well, in your own experience, when you were in Afghanistan, did you feel that you, with certainty, never killed any civilians?
No, and really what probably disturbed me most was that I received this report saying that I helped kill over 200 enemies. And there was no mention of civilian casualties, and if I were to go to my commander or anybody higher up, I would be denied access to seeing what the civilian casualty reports were.
How disturbing is that for you?
It's incredibly disturbing. I don't know if it's like a new thing in warfare in terms of just hiding civilian casualties, and the secretive aspect of it is definitely new, and that disturbs me a lot.
Is it because of your own experience? Is it because it is so troubling to you what your role in this program has been? Is that why you feel compelled to make this amicus brief in support of Mr. Jabber?
I do. Based off of my experience, there are hundreds of responsibilities within the drone program, but also